But so if you go over to the book of Acts, chapter 10, please, we're going to pick up where we left off this morning as Peter is continuing on his mission to carry the gospel forward. So last week, we were reminded together of how God never stops working in the expected and unexpected situations we may be facing. When he intervenes and does those impossible things with impossible people and situations, we're reminded of how his grace is extended to us through the message of Jesus. Well, this morning, it takes a bit of a turn on the same theme. This morning, we're going to see how God does more of those amazing things with impossible people. But sometimes the impossible people are us. And sometimes those amazing things are things that we're blind to. So humans, as a rule, are funny creatures. I think it's because we're the most uniquely stubborn. And now I can already hear the objections from those of you who have owned a cat, or to be more correct, has been owned by a cat. But truly speaking, we are the most stubborn creatures on God's green earth. So because when we get something in our mind and we become sure that it's the correct way, the only way of looking at things, it's nigh impossible to change our minds. And however, even with that stubbornness, unlike cats, we can change our mind about something. But it's never easy, and it usually doesn't happen all at once. It often takes time for us to change. It takes preparation. And I think this is especially true about our deepest convictions, which in our day are usually our religious beliefs or political beliefs and affiliations. This is one of those things that really hasn't changed much throughout all of history, because you see, the Apostle Peter also had his mind made up about certain things. But over time, God has been at work on him. And as we'll see this morning, God ultimately changed his mind through a vision. And this morning, as we're going to look at that vision and what it's made up of, and through this, we're going to try to learn what is it that God is trying to show us today. What is it God will change our minds about in our lives? So first, we see that this vision was a prophetic revelation. And we pick up in verse 9, it says, about noon the next day, as they were on their journey, those people we spoke about, and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. So backing up, Luke has just introduced a new character into the story, the Roman centurion named Cornelius. And though this man had grown up in the Roman religious system, which worshiped many gods, he had left all of that behind to become a God-fearer and someone who was probably on the way to converting to the Jewish faith. It's something that may have happened in his life that inspired this and brought this about. We really aren't sure. But for some reason, he has begun to worship the God of Israel. He's been drawn into this faith. And he is in what essentially amounts to middle management in the Roman Empire. So he's kind of putting his job on the risk there, because in the Roman army, the centurion was over about 300 to 600 people. He was not the highest rank. He was more in the middle. He was the guy who got stuff done. And so this man received a vision of an angel during the afternoon prayer, which was at about 3, and that told him God had heard his prayer and instructed him to send someone to Joppa to retrieve Peter, which is where we left him last week. And he's still there with those believers after he raised Tabitha from the dead. And this is about another day away from where Cornelius is. And so he sends these men on their way to do as the angel says. And as those men are on their way, we come back to find Peter in the house of Simon the tanner, where he was staying. An interesting place for him to stay, since tanners dealt with dead animals, and so their job was often ceremonially unclean by Jewish standards. And so Peter has slipped away from his own, and he's gone up to the rooftop, which is flat. It's a place in the ancient world, they constructed their roofs this way. And this is probably part of his normal routine. And because at about noon, he got hungry and he asked for some food. And while that food was being prepared, Peter was still on the rooftop, and suddenly he fell into a trance. And what follows is this vision that's given to Peter from the Lord. And since he's in this trance-like state, now he's not, he didn't fall over and he's got this vision going on. And he's staring out. And he's probably seeing this with his eyes wide open. And in this vision, he sees something coming down like a sheet, or some people suggest like a sail from a sailboat. And it's being lowered by four corners. And it says in verse 12, in it were all kinds of four-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. So as you're reading this, just put yourself in Peter's shoes for a minute here. He's been ministering to these believers and is sitting tirelessly, but as he stops his busyness to take just a moment to sit and pray before the Lord, to recharge, and he's sitting there waiting on his food, and then there's this thing that suddenly happens. The sail, something Peter would be very familiar with as a fisherman, just comes down out of the sky, and on it there's every animal that you could possibly imagine. Now, Peter has seen a lot of amazing things since he began to follow Jesus all those years ago, but he'd seen people miraculously healed, nature miraculously changed and calmed, and even two of the Old Testament saints standing on earth again. But this was something of a different animal. Perhaps this was probably the most unique thing that he's seen yet, because this is wrapped up in this sheet is a riddle, a mystery. This is a prophetic vision. And one of the things about prophetic visions you'll find throughout the Bible and in modern day as well is that they're usually not very straightforward. They are usually a picture of some kind, something that has deep meaning beyond the surface of what you see and what it appears to be. And this is a way that God chooses to operate when he works with his people through prophecy. And we know prophecy is a broad category of spiritual gifting. We have people who get words of knowledge and words of wisdom, words of knowledge being things that people have no way of really knowing, words of wisdom being direction and discernment. And these things tend to be very clear and easier to understand. But also we see there are prophetic words, either about the present, the future, or a person, which should be rarely solely interpreted by the person who received that word. Discernment is also a gift that goes hand in hand with prophecy to make things clear. In the multitude of discerners, there is often wisdom. So then there's another category of prophetic dreams and visions, and these tend to be very enigmatic, mysterious things, pictures that God gives to people that are a little harder to understand than others. And the only way to understand them often is to break down the elements of that vision to decipher the message. Now, for example, I'm going to use this. My wife's an art teacher, so I can use this example. She studied art for a long time, and as you go back through history, a lot of art, and paintings especially, have elements in them that are layered with meaning. Every element in a certain painting is there to convey a message that the artist is trying to share. And so using that principle, it may not surprise us to know that God often works the same way. When he gives prophetic pictures or dreams, every part of them has a meaning. And now it can be hard for us to understand it, like it's hard for me to understand art sometimes, but it often takes the wisdom of others to interpret what God is trying to say, because we need each other as the body of Christ. But in the Bible, often when the prophets or the apostles are given these signs, the Lord does something special and speaks directly to them to explain what they've just seen. And these happen repeatedly, often to confirm their meaning, especially at pivotal moments in the history of the people of God. To discern the meaning of this vision of Peter's, we have to do some of that. We have to deconstruct it, to look at the elements of it, and to consider its purpose. So this vision for Peter is prophetic as he's operating in his gift and office as an apostle. But the purpose of this vision is it's a preparatory vision. The purpose of this vision was to prepare Peter for what God was about to do. Like I said, humans are stubborn and slow to change. And the change that he's about to see is something that's going to happen very fast. And sometimes that takes a literal act of God. So verse 13, we see it says, "Then he heard a voice "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. So on this sail that was being pulled on 4 directions, there's animals of every kind. And it seemed especially the kind that was forbidden under Jewish dietary laws. And so when Peter hears this voice that says, "Go and get something to eat," this is something he could not easily bring himself to do. This was challenging a core belief that he had. And it's not that he wasn't hungry. We know that he's been waiting on lunch just downstairs. But it was that he could not bring himself to disobey this command in the Old Testament. The dietary laws, we kind of scoot, on this side of the Old Testament, we kind of scoot over them, really. But they were a very important part of who the Jewish people were. It was one of those things that set them apart from the Gentile nations around them. And it was so fiercely held that they would even risk death to keep it. For instance, do you remember in the book of Daniel when the Hebrew children are taken and they would not eat the king's meat? Or in the second book of Maccabees, there's a prolonged story of these young men who refused to break God's law by eating pork. You find that in chapter 5 and chapter 6 of 2nd Maccabees. And all of this is likely in Peter's mind, these stories of keeping the dietary laws as he hears this voice. Now it seems like, why would he say no? Well, maybe he thought he was being tested like Abraham. Maybe God was testing his resolve. Maybe the vision had something to do more with Simon the tanner with all these unclean animal skins. Maybe he was just starting to get a little hangry. I mean, it's possible. This whole series of events is very confusing. So he says something out that he said twice in Jesus' ministry. He says, "Surely not, Lord." Or, to put it in the vernacular, "You really can't be serious, Lord." This would be like, to put it kind of in perspective, this would be like a lifelong vegetarian being suddenly put into a situation where they're commanded to eat as much steak and Conecuh sausage as they possibly can eat. Or if, you're on the keto side of things, it's like you're suddenly faced with a giant chocolate cake and plates of biscuits are stacked around it and you're being told to eat. And you're like, but wait a minute. To put it in more religious terms, it's like if a Baptist was standing there and a sheet came down and in the middle of it is a bottle of bourbon and books on dancing. Terrible, right? It's like asking a Presbyterian to smile, or like an Anglican is looking there and a communion chalice is filled with grape juice, or they hear an hallelujah during Lent. This is like unheard of stuff. And that's how the kind of repulsion that Peter has to it. It's contrary to everything he's been taught about the way things should be done. Peter was taught radical separation from the world, which is why, the bourbon thing kind of makes a lot of sense. In these religious practices, in their clothing, in their food, all of this had a purpose in the law. It wasn't just God being arbitrary. It's something that marked them out as the people of God. It's part of their very identity. But here, God's saying to let all that go, to put it all aside. What God called clean, you must not call profane. Now, why is this happening? God's showing him something. This sheet is pulled by 4 corners, or if you'll allow me, east and west, north and south. And there's all kinds of animals on it, all varieties, full of diversity. Clean animals, unclean animals, the ins and the outs, all together on this sheet. And God's saying they're all the same. So as Peter's trying to piece this together, sorting out his confusion after this happened 3 times. You know how I talked about stubbornness? It happened 3 times. Just let that sink in a minute. These men, and as he's doing this, these men arrive. They're sent from Cornelius, and they ask for directions to the gate, and they find Peter. And look what happens in verse 19. While Peter was still thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now, get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." This is the second instance that day when the Lord told Peter to get up and do something. Before, it was metaphorical in the vision, but this time it's literal. Both times it's to interact with something that Jewish people were to remain separated from. Now, it wasn't the unclean animals. In this case, it was unredeemed Gentiles. Peter was given the keys to the kingdom. And so far, he's opened it to the Jewish people. He's opened it to the Samaritan people. But now, God's preparing him to use those keys again and to open the kingdom for all people. So we got to ask, were these pieces falling into place now? Was he beginning to understand the connection to these men who approached? Was he prepared to change his mind about that? To change his mind about them? This prophetic vision prepared Peter for this encounter. And this prophetic vision comes with powerful implication. Because that night, Peter and Simon the tanner hosted these men. They took them in and they heard their story. Though they were about as different as you could imagine, they ate together. They spoke together. They listened to each other. Now, can you imagine how that went? The awkward silences, the pauses, the weird stares. These people are so different. Are they talking? And here they are talking to each other over a shared meal. You know, as an aside, I kind of wonder how much different our world would look if we took the same tact. Unfortunately, in our culture today, we do a lot of our talking through comment sections and poorly made memes on social media. When we do face-to-face, it's across picket lines. We don't sit down and have meals anymore. You know, I remember seeing a story. It was about 4 years ago, during the height of all the stuff that was going on at that point. There was this demonstration that was scheduled to happen in this town, and instead of gearing up and locking down, the police department there had an idea. They met with the organizers of this demonstration. They arranged instead a community barbecue, and where they all sat down and had an open, frank discussion. And while I don't know what the outcome of all that was, I didn't really track it down, there is something incredibly powerful about the idea here of those people sitting down. And what they did is they left their political ideology and cultural differences aside to talk about the real issues, the real human issues. And though there was a reason for both sides to have maybe some hostility toward each other, they chose the way of peace. Do you know what that kind of looks like? It looks a lot like the one Peter followed for 3 years and watched as time and time again he sat down and ate with the tax collectors and the sinners. It looks a lot like the one who challenged a Gentile woman's racial assumptions when she came to him on behalf of her daughter. And in turn, Jesus challenged the disciples' assumptions about the Gentiles and the power of the kingdom. So Peter is doing something here that we can really learn from in our day of incredible division. The same thing that Jesus did. Radical acceptance of someone despite their differences. There were people Jesus was really hard on, but you know, those tended to be the religious people. When it came down to people different from him, Jesus was very accepting. Affirming? No, but accepting. As Peter is sitting there, this vision that he had still fresh in his mind, looking at these Roman citizens who have different political outlooks, different cultural outlooks, different values, even different ethnicities, and those words are still there in his mind, ringing with every moment that goes by. What God has called clean, do not call profane. Can I give you a little translation of that? Don't turn away what God sent you. So after this evening, Peter goes with them that next morning, and here's what happens. It says, verse 25, on Peter's arrival, Cornelius met him, and falling at his feet, worshipped him. But Peter made him get up, saying, "Stand up, I'm only a mortal." And as he talked with him, he went in and found that many had assembled. And he said to them, "You yourselves know that it is unlawful for a Jew to associate with or visit a Gentile. But God has shown me that I should not call anyone profane or unclean. So when I was sent to you, I came without objection." And with those words, can you hear the keys of the kingdom rattling in the lock? With those men gathered there, Peter's opening a door that had been shut for centuries, for millennia. He's tearing down those walls between them, reaching across over these really complicated fault lines that lie in their differences, and he's welcoming them in. The implication of this revelation is so powerful because what started as a movement restricted to the descendants of Jacob has now spilled over, and the light of Christ is shining outside the camp, piercing through the outer darkness. We're going to, dig through this a little more in the next few weeks, but I want you to just leave you with this one thought. As stubborn as we are, slow to change our mindset as we are, as hard as it may be, when we see a story like this, we got to consider, when you look at the world around you, what's on your sheet? If God were to give you a vision of a sheet coming down from heaven, and on it were things that were for so long you thought you couldn't associate with, lines you could not cross, things that were too volatile, what would it be? Where are the lines for you? Are they social? Is it class? Is it political? Is it racial? Is it sexuality? Who are the people that you hesitate to share a meal with? Now, don't answer that out loud, please. Don't do that. But consider it, because those answers tell us a lot about what we believe about the gospel. Where we draw lines, we're saying, I believe God's mighty to save, but not that mighty. I believe God commands me to love my neighbor, but only the ones that look like me, think like me, and live like me. The gospel is really that strong. It's really that powerful. It really is. God can take a Jewish man like Peter, who at one point in his life was willing to cut down every Roman soldier he came across. And by the work of the Holy Spirit in his life, the power of the gospel, he's become the kind of person who sat down with a centurion and his men and gave them the gospel. What divides us? What possible thing can divide us so much that the gospel cannot bridge it? What is it that holds us? What's on our sheet? Where do we try to limit God? We don't need to be controlled by our differences. That's what the world's doing, and we see how that's working out. The power of God to change us, no matter how stubborn, no matter how slow we are to change, no matter how different, is greater than anything that separates us. So as we look at this subject a little more the next few weeks, and I'll say, in preparation for this, I've been made uncomfortable. I think that's a good thing. Will you join me in inviting the Spirit of God to show us what's on our sheet? Where are those lines? And as he shows you, will you, like Peter, be obedient to go to them without hesitation and watch the kingdom of God grow? Amen. Please stand.